bit of background first. Good to tell you that I came to reading as a result in the late 90s of having some children in my class, 2 children who were really struggling with reading. And I had a colleague say to me, Dianne, you just have to accept that you will always have children who will fail. And I just found that astounding and thought, no, as a teacher, I have responsibility to make sure that every child learns to read. And I had the opportunity to do a diploma in special teaching needs, where I learnt about really effective techniques, was introduced to the research. And necessity is the mother of invention, and I ended up in a position where I needed to design a reading program for children who were in late primary school and early secondary school. And so putting that research from the Diploma of Special Teaching Needs into practice became the genesis for Thinking Reading. I went on and set up a literacy centre in New Zealand and 2 in London.
So I'm James. I started my career as a secondary English teacher. After about 7 years, I realised that I knew very, very little about how children actually learn. And I was fortunate to be able to go and do the Special Teaching Needs Diploma that Diane's already mentioned. And that was completely revolutionary in terms of changing my attitude to teaching, because for the first time I was acquainted with actual substantive empirical research that enabled us to tell whether what we were doing was effective or not. I've spent quite a bit of time encouraging colleagues to engage with research, and now my role really is to advance the agenda that we've got around reading. And so part of what we're sharing today is in line with that and helping people to understand more about the problem and the solutions. So we're just going to share our screen now. Bear with me while I grapple with the technology. And I'll put that up and slideshow play from start. Okay, so hopefully you can now see our screen. We are going to look first of all at the scale and nature of the problem. We don't want to spend a long time on this, but unfortunately we do find regularly people who say there is no reading problem and you're making a bit of fuss about nothing. So
what's the Barris Project? So it's the first large-scale longitudinal study of secondary students reading in the UK, and this quote comes from the first sentence of the report, and I think it's worth noting that the 20% figure is consistent nationally.
Internationally.
Sorry, internationally.
If we go back to 2012, when the OEC did the PISA tests, we find then that 15-year-olds on that test, 17% of them were not at the minimum level of proficiency. So at the end of secondary school, people are pretty much in the same boat. Just this year, GL Assessment released a study called Read All About It. And they found that 1/4 of students at 15 still have a reading age of 12 or below. And they also found that there was a significant correlation between reading ability and GCSE results measured across all subjects. So that includes science and maths, which actually were almost as strongly correlated as English language.
So what is it to be functionally illiterate? Well, to be reading at below the level of an 11-year-old, not to be able to read a medicine bottle, to be able to read the front page of a broadsheet newspaper, not to be able to read the theory test for a driving license or business letters. And for adults who have really low literacy, they find it difficult and can only read really rudimentary text. So they can recognize their name, they can recognize very frequent words, but that is it. And I think the key thing here is the proportion of poor children with reading difficulties is actually double. So when we say 20% of children who are reading well behind same age peers, when we look at poor children, that just children from disadvantaged backgrounds, that goes up to 40%.
So to just quickly summarize the section, 15 to 20% of students who are arriving at secondary school are significantly behind in their reading. Poor children are twice as likely to be affected by that problem, and those levels are pretty much maintained throughout secondary school. And as we're about to see in the next section, literacy problems have enduring, pervasive, and costly consequences, big consequences. So what are they? You want to mention that?
So these are the consequences for many children at the end of secondary school. They have reduced access to higher education, which means that they have more limited job choices, on average lower income, and higher risk of permanent exclusion. And these are the long-term consequences. So they have poorer health, they often have poorer housing, more likely to have mental health issues, higher rates of incarceration, and sadly, shorter life expectancy.
So we're not talking about a small problem. The cost to society way back in 2012 was estimated at 23 billion per annum. And the Read On, Get On campaign, which was a coalition of about 20 quite well-respected charities in 2014, had a conservative estimate that the impact on GDP was about 43 billion in 2025. So that, for context, is about the size of the schools budget for England and Wales, with a population of about 60 million people. So what about the students who actually go through this experience, and what's it like for them at school? It has cognitive impacts because issues like vocabulary development and background knowledge are affected. It has behavioral consequences because they disengage from school, and it has motivational consequences because continuous failure and continually feeling that you are worse than your peers and can't access what they're talking about makes you demotivated. That leads to slower development of other cognitive skills and inhibited academic performance across a range of subjects, which ties in with what the GL assessment mentioned earlier. And what Stanovich points out in this article way back in '86 was that those effects become more generalized over time. That is, they affect more and more areas of their lives. So for those students, in terms of their emotional and mental health experience, frustration, agitation, withdrawal, social isolation, and this nice phrase, socio-emotional maladjustment, which means they are difficult kids. Now, every child is an individual, but as generalizations, these things are fairly sobering.
So what are the causes? Well, we don't have enough time to go into this in any great detail, but we do want to address some of the most common attributions. So these are some of the most common ones. We have poverty blamed, we have poor parenting, and also disability in the forms of labeling children as to why they can't learn to read. Frequently, people assume that poverty causes illiteracy, and this is not really correct. Poor literacy is actually part of a cycle. It's both a driver and a consequence. And yeah. So
Louisa Moats, who's an American expert on reading, points out that a third of poor readers are actually from college-educated families. They're people who are going to be much more likely to have not only good reading skills, but better incomes. So it isn't simply a case of being poor.
And when you think about it, surely if children are at school for 5 hours a day, 5 days a week, that's 190 school days, 950 hours a year, 5,700 hours in 6 years of primary schooling. And it actually takes about 100 to 150 hours to teach a child to read to get them to a point where they can begin to learn to decode new words for themselves.
So, so rather than blame parents, perhaps we should be considering that there are some endemic disabilities. And this is a fraught area. So I'm just going to make a couple of points. The first is that is way back in the 90s, well-respected researchers like Stanovich were suggesting that the term dyslexia has limited utility because of the way in which it's been bandied about. And there are lots of definitions floating about that aren't particularly helpful. And in reality, it's not practical to distinguish between students who are poor readers versus students who are dyslexic. Now, I know that some people have said, even quite recently, that it is, but actually that data or that assertion is strongly contested in the research. The main point for us as educators is it actually makes very little difference, because everybody agrees that how you teach a student labeled dyslexic is exactly how you need to teach a student who's labeled poor reader. So from a teaching point of view, there is no point in making the distinction. So a couple of issues that are worth exploring are the matter of orthography, the written language, and secondly, how we teach children to read. To briefly mention orthography, English has one of the most complicated relationships between the written language and the spoken language in the world. And that makes English much harder to read than a language like Finnish or Spanish, which has a virtually one-to-one correspondence between letters and sounds. Dianne's compiled an assessment that checks that students know all the different sound spelling correspondences in English. So far, she's found 478, as opposed to something like 23 in Finnish. So whereas in one of those languages, students can learn to decode in a few months, in the English-speaking world, it takes 2 to 3 years of school to become quite confident. And there are many, many opportunities in there for confusion and misconception to set in. The second thing is, relating to that, that if we teach in such a way as to anticipate and eliminate those misconceptions, we can teach nearly all of those children to read successfully. And to cite a particular study that's quite well known, this one from 2004, a school district in the United States, they comprehensively tested all the students in year 1. They identified 9% of the students as having a dyslexic profile. They taught them systematically and explicitly, and in one semester, only 0.5% of those students still had reading difficulties. So, low literacy, very poor consequences for individuals and for society, and it's a key driver of inequality. And the major reason we would propose that people have reading difficulties is that our teaching is not sufficiently rigorous to ensure that they are taught what they need to know early. But it's actually good news, because if the problem lies in teaching, it means that the solutions can also rely on teaching.
So let's look at the solutions, but let's be clear that they must be factors that we can control or at least influence. So we can't delude ourselves that there's any quick win when it comes to adolescents with reading problems. The problems and their consequences have become entrenched and pervasive, and reversing this takes time, effort, and above all, expertise. So to address this problem, we need a multifaceted approach. There are no silver bullets. So we need to address this at the systems level, at the classroom level, and also at the intervention level. So the first thing that we need to do is actually have proactive screening. We need a detailed assessment for effective intervention. And one of the most important things that we need to do is actually weed out poor performance because of poor motivation. And that can happen a lot. And we also need to know, does the child have difficulty with decoding, you know, lifting those words off the page, or do they have problems with comprehension, or do they have problems with both?
So the second main area that is worth considering, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on it today, unfortunately. I know that some English teachers here will be like, well, this is what I'm here for. But it's such a big area that I think it's probably best to just point out some signposts. The first thing that we need to do is make sure that all schools have a reading-rich curriculum. That is, there needs to be lots of reading in every lesson, and that's so that students get lots of practice at reading throughout their time in school. That's something that we can do with relatively low investment. We don't need any extra staffing for that. We just need to change our practice in the classroom somewhat. The second thing, which is a CPD issue, is ensuring that teachers understand how important reading is in their subject. And many teachers think that, you know, because I'm a teacher of PE or geography, etc., that it doesn't apply. But for one thing, the GL assessment study that I mentioned earlier points out that actually there is a strong correlation between reading and success across all subjects. And secondly, the way that the curriculum, particularly I'm speaking from experience in the UK, has been redesigned means that students have to have the ability to access that curriculum, which involves a lot more reading. The third thing is effective classroom support strategies for weaker readers, because as soon as you give people a more challenging level of content, and as soon as you up that reading content in the classroom, it will become very apparent who your genuinely weak readers are. And so that the classroom has to be adapted for that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but we've got a blog post called 6 Ways to Help Struggling Readers in the Secondary Classroom. And also chapter 4 in our book, Thinking Reading, goes into those support strategies in detail. So I don't feel like we need to spend a lot more time on that here. If we talk about the issue of interventions, there are a couple of distinctions to make before we go into that in more detail. But students who are reading up to 2 or 3 years behind, we would say are behind in their reading, but they don't fit the category of well behind, which are students who are reading 3 or more years behind. And those two levels of intervention are quite different. Students who are reading 2 to 3 years behind can be taught in pairs or small groups. The level of intervention is less intensive. Students who are reading well behind need more individualized instruction. As you'll see, if that doesn't happen, they won't get through and actually catch up in time. And then the third point is that those students' needs then need to be split according to whether their needs are based on decoding, getting the words off the page, comprehension, understanding what is meant, or both. And so we would say that the hallmarks of effective intervention, we've got a fairly extensive blog post called 15 Tests for Effective Reading Interventions in Secondary School, which goes into this in more detail. But Engelman's work on direct instruction provides a really good framework for looking at what constitutes effective teaching. And the first thing that we must have is systematic analysis of what it is we're going to teach, because many misconceptions and confusions arise when we don't. And then secondly, there are some teaching procedures which are much better than others at providing flawless, faultless, logical communication. And although it goes against the grain for many of us to do things that don't take account of our natural creativity and artistry, in fact, what these children need is really clear teaching. We also have to monitor progress really closely. The idea that you have an intervention with a pre-test and a post-test and nothing in between, it makes no sense at all, because a child could waste 6 months making no progress and you wouldn't know. They need to be assessed pretty much daily so that as soon as something goes wrong, we can make an adjustment and get them back on track. And fourthly, we need really rigorous evaluation processes. So we need to know by collecting all this data, how effective we are being. And if we aren't self-evaluating all the time, our efforts are likely to be mediocre at best, because it's only through a process of rigorous self-evaluation that we fine-tune our processes and make the adjustments that individual students need. So there's a really good rubric on direct instruction programs by Engelman and Colvin, and I'd recommend you read it as long as you've got a cold towel to put over your head.
Okay, so the content for effective intervention, and the jury is actually back in, and we know that phonics is the effective way to teach reading. And then secondly, word study, so looking at etymology, looking at morphology and syntax. Fluency is so important. If you have slow, halting reading, it really compromises comprehension. Vocabulary, we hear so much about vocabulary and its importance, and explicit teaching focused on tier 2 words is really, really important. And comprehension, so key general strategies such as the different types of inference, but it goes without saying that subject teachers will need to build background knowledge in their subject to foster comprehension. And motivation is so important, and actually success comes before motivation. Motivation doesn't come before success. So when children are actually successful at doing something, they become motivated.
So there is the question then about, for students with really serious reading problems, what approaches have the most impact? What are, to use that often quoted phrase these days, the best bets? And we would say there actually isn't a lot of room in the research for needing to place bets. It's pretty clear. The first thing is that students with severe reading problems usually have an underlying difficulty with phonological processing, and they often have a problem with phonemic awareness, the ability to discriminate between phonemes and to manipulate those phonemes within words. And the best and most effective programs for these students address that issue aggressively by teaching advanced phonemic awareness, teaching them to recognize and manipulate those sounds. And it might sound unlikely, but actually you will find that students who are regularly regarded as no hope of getting better, actually when they're taught phonemic awareness can improve. And we'll show you an example in a moment. Those programs also taught and reinforced phonic decoding skills and gave ample opportunities to read connected text. So we're not just talking about drill and kill, we're talking about translating the practical skills into reading actual text.
Okay, so just putting a human face on it. So this was a young boy I taught a number of years ago now, but he's certainly not an isolated case. So, he arrived in year 7 reading at less than a 5-year level. He was British born. It wasn't English as an additional language issue. He had just failed at reading. And you can imagine what his behavior was like. He was an incredibly frustrated young man. But look at what can happen. This is the impact of teaching phonemic awareness on a child who would have been written off. And he was the child that you often hear, yeah, phonics works for most children, but it doesn't work for everybody. Whereas in actual fact, for spending a few months with him on working on phonemic awareness, but we weren't just working on phonemic awareness. There was a lot of work to do and actually getting him to change his attitude, because he was so frightened of making a mistake that he just wouldn't take a risk. So we were working on that as well. But you can see that in the 3rd phase, the progress that he made once those issues had been addressed. So he made 9.5 years progress in his reading in 2 years and 4 months, and ended up reading at a 14-year level.
And I think it's really important, that comment that Dianne's made, that alongside the actual teaching, it's really important that we are managing these students really, really well in terms of their motivation, their understanding of themselves as learners, and training them into more successful reading behaviours and habits. Another feature of really effective reading interventions is that there are opportunities for students to develop rapid word recognition. And by that, what we mean is very rapid decoding. We don't mean that students memorize what the word looks like. So to put this in context, Stanislas Dehaene, the neuroscientist, says that fluent readers read silently at 300 words per minute. That's 5 words a second. That's 0.2 of a second for each word. And each of those words, when we analyze what's going on in the brain and with the eyes, we find that they are decoding through the word, matching those spellings to sounds, turning that into a word, matching that word to their vocabulary, their own experience, any emotional associations with that word, and then linking that to the context in which they're reading it. And that's why the words seem to disappear when you're reading really fluently. And what we need to understand is children with reading problems don't have that level of fluency. For them, they are reading at maybe a word a second, which is 5 times too slowly. So we need to build their skills to fluency. A second or third area is that effective interventions have to have a fast rate of progress. One of the reasons for that is that it takes so long to catch up that they will have missed a lot of curriculum time. I remember visiting a phonics lesson that was going on, and students were allocated to, this was a secondary school, allocated to phonics lessons for 4 hours a week. So they were losing nearly 20% of their curriculum time in the week, and half the students in there actually didn't even need phonics. So then there's the question of what's an acceptable rate of progress? How fast do they need to work? And let's just quickly do the maths. If they're 3 years behind and they make 1 year's extra progress a year, it will still take them 3 years to catch up. That's 3 years of curriculum time that they've lost. So actually, they don't need that rate. They need a much faster rate than double. And then the question arises as to how it can be achieved. We'll give you an example in a moment. But a key point that Bill Hewitt made in this 2003 paper is that there is a really unhelpful understanding out there that slower progress is what students who are further behind need. And it's the other way around. Obviously, if they're further behind, they need a faster rate of progress. And to go along with that, teaching at a faster pace actually aids their learning. So Greg Brooks, emeritus professor from Sheffield University, he says that looking at interventions, it's reasonable to expect at least double the standard rate of progress. I've outlined the problem with only achieving double the standard rate of progress at secondary school. So how fast can children catch up?
Okay, so this young man, this is an example of a child who made very, very rapid progress, and that actually taught him that he wasn't the person that he'd been told that he was. And in year 7, he, which here in the UK is reading at an 11 to 12-year-old, his mean CAT score, his IQ score was 76. In year 8, he was graded at reading at 7 years, and he was assessed in year 10 actually at reading at a 6-year level. And he made 9 years progress in 13 months. They weren't an easy 13 months. They were quite difficult, but he went on to get 5 A stars to C, including English and maths for his GCSEs. He went into the 6th form, he became a student leader, and this is not just because he learnt to read, but obviously it played a big part. But he actually went to university, so he would be graduated now. So, think about what people were saying about this young man before he started his reading lessons. He had been written off. People did not think that he would catch up, but he did. He showed them all that they were quite wrong.
And so then the comment sometimes comes back, oh, well, that's fine for that individual, but you'll always have your individual success stories. So here's just a little bit of an example from a school. In the first year, 18 students made 2.8 months progress on average. In the second year, 2.4 months progress on average. And in the third year, another 17 students made just over 2 months progress on average. And that's per lesson. That's not 2 months over the program. So, and you can see that some of those students made as much as 4, nearly 5 months progress a lesson, because we're talking about a very specific set of skills. And if they're taught using really effective research evidence approaches, we can teach that very efficiently and see very rapid gains. And what I guess one of the real key points we're wanting to make today is that if people take the trouble to look into the research, look at how to teach these students effectively, much more can be achieved than we think. And that's really important because the consequences of not doing so are so negative.
And here is why it's actually worth all that effort. So these are the comments that children have made once they had actually been taught to read at their age.
And you'll notice the word confident coming through.
And with Edelyn, this was a girl, and if you had met her, you would have thought she had no problem with confidence. She was, very, very outspoken. But as it is for so many children, it was just a mask. She put a front on, just hiding how, how frustrated and how inadequate she actually felt.
That's a student who's saying, learning to read was a life-changing experience. And everything I've learned about this area suggests that that's exactly true. And I think that the word scared there says a lot to us about how children often feel when they are at school being asked to read every day, and they know that if they make a mistake, their peers are going to ridicule them. And this young lady was one of the most, I would have thought, confident, overconfident people I've ever met. But actually, when she learned to read, all her brashness and abrasiveness diminished, and she became a very pleasant, calm person. And when you see a very quiet boy grow in confidence and volunteer to read in class, you know that something really significant has happened. So to summarize what we've talked about so far, and then I think it looks like we're going to have comfortable time to open up for questions. I hope we haven't rushed too fast, but the key points we've tried to make today are that no child should leave school without being able to read. We know how to teach them. Schools have to take responsibility for that, and we have to set up proactive and systematic systems. When we develop our curriculum in schools, we need reading to happen frequently in class, and we shouldn't be dumbing that down. We should be basically upping the level. But when we do that, it will expose the students who have reading problems, and so we have to make sure that we provide for that through a range of ways. We talk more about that in our blog posts in our book, but basically what it means is making sure that the classroom becomes a really supportive, safe space where children can work together to help each other access their reading. If we're putting children into interventions, we should only do that when we've done really close assessment and we've made sure that they actually do have a real reading problem and not a motivation problem. And secondly, those interventions must be matched very closely to the student's actual type of need and how far behind they are. Those interventions should be explicit because that is a much more efficient way to teach. They should be systematic to make sure that everything the student needs to know is taught. They should be research informed in their practice in order to ensure that it's done as efficiently as possible. And they should be rigorously evaluated to make sure that we're actually having the impact that we want. And those students have to make fast progress. If they're in an intervention where they're making slow progress, you might as well have them in the classroom. At least then they are keep staying in touch with their curriculum. So that's a quick overview, and we're open now for questions. And Elaine, if you're there, perhaps you could introduce those.
Would you like to stop sharing your screen perhaps so we can see?
Yep, we'll do that. There we are.
Okay, so the questions are coming in now. Would like to pin your window. How can you assess if a child's issue is phonemic awareness?
That's a very, very good question. Dave, there are various tests that you can use that are downloadable for free. And also David Kilpatrick has one in his book. What we'll do is we're going to, I know this is going to be on the researchED channel, but we'll also put this PowerPoint up on our blog, through our website, and we'll provide links to different resources like that. So we'll put one to David Kilpatrick's book.
Thank you.
So very well worth reading that book.
So I'm just seeing one question there. Is Toe by Toe a good reading scheme? Toe by Toe is a phonics program. It's a very good program, but we don't really want to get into talking about particular programs. Happy to talk about content.
There's another question here from Helena. Can you recommend any courses, books, or CPD on phonics? I think lots of us secondary teachers feel like, what's going on with all this? And in fact, a lot of primary teachers we've talked to who teach upper primary also say they don't feel they have adequate knowledge of phonics. We can certainly recommend Debbie Hepplewhite at Phonics International. She has a low-cost CPD course for teachers, and a number of secondary teachers that we know have been very pleased that they've done that course.
And also John Wright, It Sounds Right, is actually on Udemy, I think it is. You can go there, and I think it's free as well. So a very good phonics program.
Yes. So I'm just running through these. I hope that we'll be able to answer quite a few questions. Kirsty has asked, what would you recommend a literacy lead in mathematics at secondary to roll out to students to help increase their literacy and understanding in that subject? I think that from the work that I've done in secondary schools over the last year, where I've gone into a lot of maths classrooms and looked at the work that they're doing, the level of tier 3 vocabulary that students have to grapple with in mathematics is massive, and effective ways to teach keywords are really important. They need to be introduced and then practiced frequently. I would suggest after they're introduced, repeated quizzing, and make sure that each quiz, 70% of the items have been previously presented, and only 3 out of 10 items should be items that haven't been quizzed on before. In other words, lots of repetition of learning tier 3 words. And when you are presenting a tier 3 word, or indeed a tier 2 word, new vocabulary is a very simple procedure which Rosenshine fans / addicts will probably know as I do, we do, you do. We would call it model, lead and test, where you would simply say, this word is, say it with me, now you say it on your own, and then you discuss the word. So this word is trigonometry, say it with me, trigonometry on your own, and then make sure that students understand that, and then bring that in repeated quizzing. Those two things don't take a lot of time or effort. All teachers can accommodate those into their practice, but they should give you quite a lot of leverage for your students.
And someone asking if the same approaches work for EAL or students new to school. But regarding EAL, I think the important thing is making sure that they've got enough proficiency in oral language first. At the first school I worked at here in London, worked alongside the head of EAL, and in those days we used to use something called the Hilary Hester scale. And I didn't take children into the reading program until they were at level 3. So if you think, level 1, very new to English, level 4, quite fluent, we would only take children who were level 3 or level 4. And that was actually proven to me because I had a subsequent EAL teacher who was also the Senko, and she was my friend, and she put a lot of pressure on me to take 2 children into the reading program who were at the upper end of level 2, sorry. And I did, and I'm pleased I did, but I actually had to spend a lot of time actually explaining the vocabulary. So it actually wasn't a good use of time. So they would have been much better to have had more time actually developing their oral language first.
Yeah, so we say fluent in conversational English before you try reading interventions with EAL students. Can we just have a look at Freya's question up there? Freya's asked, hi Freya, what are your best tips for helping students with their fluency of reading? And that's a really good question, because it's all very well to bang on about it, but how do you do it? And it depends a little bit on how far behind they are. If we're talking about students who can read accurately but slowly, we would suggest, first of all, a paired reading program where a student reads with a more proficient buddy. And that buddy has some training in how to correct them if they make decoding errors. But the aim is to actually get them reading and then take a 1-minute timing somewhere in the middle of that, and over time, see that that's built up. You can also use a process called repeated reading. And it's probably going to take a little bit long to explain here now, but basically the student reads the same bit of text progressively to see if they can beat their last score in terms of how quickly they read it. That's a very specific speed exercise. You need to do it quite a bit to see it generalize into other areas, but it's all about helping them to become more automatic in their recognition of words.
Okay, so a question here, how often and for how long would you recommend an intervention lasts?
Yes.
And that's actually a question we get asked a lot. People say, so, how long is the thinking reading course? And the simple answer is, it depends on how far behind the child is, and so how much do they have to make up? And what's important is that the intervention should be such that there is no ceiling, that the child is able to be in a program until they actually reach their chronological age. The first school that I started at here in the UK, I was told, get the children reading to a 9-year level, because once they're reading a 9-year level, they can read the Sun. And I thought, whoop-de-doo. And, to spend all that time, all that investment in getting a child to read to a 9-year level, I'm afraid I just disregarded that and just kept them in the program until they were reading at their chronological age. And I think, reading is a basic foundational right for every child. They should be leaving school reading at their chronological age.
Great. There's a question from Charlotte. Do you think it's realistic to have an expectation of all students in the class to read? And I know that some teachers worry that, you're letting students off the hook. But I would say if you give students the option to pass, they will very rarely do so. And if they do so, given the what that implies about their confidence with their peers, that's probably what they needed to do. So the first thing is give them a pass to say, one of the ground rules in our class is if you don't want to read aloud, you don't have to. But I do agree, Charlotte, that your comment there about giving the student advance notice, asking them, saying to them, I'll be asking you to read this sentence in a minute or two, and giving them the time to get ready is a really good idea. and consideration from teachers around those things, awareness of how your students are feeling when you do reading as a group is really important to creating that safe space, and that has an enormous impact on how hard they try and therefore how much practice they get. So,
okay, Emma's asked, what intervention programs would you recommend for struggling readers in a primary school? So, I mean, on our website, you know, in our FAQs, we actually have that as one of the questions. And once again, James has already mentioned Debbie Hepplewhite at Phonics International, and also Sounds Right. So I'd have a look at both of them.
Yeah, and there was a question which I think is an important one. Can CAT scores, that's CAT scores for those who aren't familiar, are basically intelligence tests, and they produce a standardized ranking of students. And a lot of schools use them when students first arrive as a sort of a check on their general abilities, and secondly, for streaming, particularly in maths and science. Can they be used to monitor reading progress? No, there are much more specific reading skills tests that you can use. All standardized tests will give you a broad ranking, and that will have a reliability within what's called a standard error of measurement. If you really want to check how well a student is reading and what they need to be taught, you will need to take the assessment down to a much finer level. And I mean, we're not going to try and go into all that now because, you know, we normally take 2 days to train staff to do that. But what we would say is use a reading test if you want to check on reading. Standardized tests, be careful not to overuse them. Probably twice a year is sufficient. Anything more frequent than that, you're probably not going to get meaningful data.
Mm. And Helen has asked how much time needs to go into intervention, and do students continue to attend usual lessons at the same time, and what training do staff need to deliver this program? I don't know if you mean our program, but anyway, as far as time going into intervention, so with thinking reading, children come for 3 half-hour lessons, because what's really important at secondary school is you've got that tension. You've got children who are sitting in class who can't access the curriculum because they can't read. But if we take them out of lessons, you know, they're missing out on what happens. So optimally, what we say is 3 half-hour lessons a week, and that their children should come out of a range of subjects so that no one subject is being hit. I've come across situations where schools say, well, look, we won't have them in MFL. If they can't read in English, what's the point in them learning another language? Valid, you think. But actually, what's our expectation of that child? Do we expect that they are never going to catch up, in which case, sure, it doesn't matter if they're missing out on learning another language. But if we have the expectation that they are going to catch up completely, then what's going to happen when they're ready? They're going to be so far behind. And I actually did have that situation. A school I started, I had a child who had been out of MFL, and she was doing a different reading program. She came to me, she caught up completely, and she was ready to go back to all her classes. And the MFL teacher said to me, please, can you keep her because she's so far behind? So I think we have to have high expectations. We have to expect that the children will catch up completely. Have I answered all of that?
Yeah, that was the one about the time. Oops.
Oops.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I hope that's answered it. As Ed has asked, where can my school access training for specific staff to teach reading, and which reading programs should be used? Where do we get it? There is a publication put out by Greg Brooks called What Works for Struggling Readers for Adolescent.
Children and young people.
Yeah, what works for children and young people. struggling readers, and he actually goes through and looks at the data from different reading programs and assigns them you know, whether he thinks that they're useful, whether they have a substantial effect or whatever. So I would suggest having a look at that. Obviously, we do training, but we're not here to push that.
But yes, we'd certainly be happy if you wanted to get in touch through the website, Ed. We can give you pointers. It depends on what aspects of reading you're wanting to teach and how far behind the students are. So probably the first thing to do is to look at whether your screening and assessment systems are in place, so you know how many students you've got and what kinds of needs they've got. Emily has asked, as a geography teacher, how can I incorporate good practice about reading into my lessons, or is it the responsibility of English staff? And the answer is it's both, isn't it? It is indeed the responsibility of English staff, but it is not their sole responsibility, because if you want students to understand your curriculum, they need to access it. A huge amount of your curriculum needs to be accessed through written language, and that means they need to read in order to access it. So key points for your classroom: plenty of reading, use buddies to help students who are weaker at reading, get them reading in pairs or small groups, do teacher reading, make sure that the students who are weakest you are checking on their comprehension. Make sure that you are listening to particularly your weaker students read at least once a week, so that you can give them a little bit of feedback. They know you're interested, and you will find that they will not only learn more, but they will try harder.
Okay. And Jennifer, oh, there she goes. Okay, Jennifer's asked which specific tests will be best to use in secondary school to ensure that you identify the particular needs students have. Well, we advocate a 3-tier level of testing. So making sure that the whole cohort are tested using a survey level assessment, something like the NGRT or something like that.
That's better say what that's.
Yeah, I'm just about going to the new group reading test, and that's important to actually make sure you test everybody, because there are some children who are very, very good at masking their reading difficulty. But then to take the bottom third on the national levels, the bottom third, and retest them using another survey level assessment. And in that way, you can actually start to weed out the children who were performing poorly because of poor motivation. And then the third level of testing that we use is there needs to be an in-depth recording of what the child is actually reading. And we use something called a reading accuracy record. And I don't want to hear a big intake of breath. This is not a running record. And that's because the analysis is actually something quite different. But we actually use graded material, and the child reads it silently to themselves. They read aloud. We take a record of exactly what the child reads. And what's important about that is we can have a look and see, are they making the same recurring mistakes? Is there a particular phoneme that they, grapheme correspondence that they have difficulty with? Are they making careless errors? And lots of children do. They're just very, very careless. And we want to make sure that when we allocate children to intervention, we've also weeded out those children who are just careless readers. So encouraging them to really work to the best of their ability. We also need to have a comprehension component so that we can look and see whether comprehension is an issue, because we have children who can read beautifully, but then you get to the comprehension questions and they really haven't got a clue. So that's what we use, and we train people to do that assessment.
Okay, so Ian's asked, what approach do you recommend for those students who are only 2 to 3 years behind? I mentioned briefly earlier that they can be taught in pairs or small groups, but it depends on the domain of difficulty. Are you teaching them phonics skills and decoding, or are you teaching them comprehension skills? And so you need to be clear on that before you try and put them into groups, because they have to have very similar needs, or some students are going to have their time wasted. Can they be taught in small groups of around 15? Possibly. There are structured direct instruction programs, Engelmann type programs, that will be very suitable for groups of 15. There are some phonics programs that will do that, but you do need to be making sure that those students are making rapid progress, and we would recommend very close assessment and very close monitoring to make sure that they're not in there for any longer than they need to be. You can also use a paired reading approach for students who are 2 to 3 years behind, and that can be very efficient because they can meet with a reading buddy who's been trained to give corrective feedback, and they can be doing that during registration time or after school, maybe depending on your school culture, even at a break or lunchtime. What else have we got?
Let's have a look.
Quite a lot of the questions are around phonics training, which I think we've answered.
Yeah.
What evidence is the best to use to motivate subject teachers outside of the English department to embed reading in their lesson? I think that a good place to start is that recent GL assessment study, which shows a very strong correlation between GCSE outcomes and reading. I think another way to do it is to ask your subject team to sit around a table with some grade 9 papers from a recent GCSE exam and go through those papers and highlight all the sophisticated, the tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary. Use different color for tier 2 and 3 because that's good professional development, working out which is which. And then have a look at those papers and look at how much of that language there is. And then get them to do the same exercise with some grade 3 papers and then compare them. And doing that simple exercise will show people the importance of reading and particularly of teaching vocabulary. And vocabulary is a really good place to start. And obviously Alex Quigley's book on closing the vocabulary gap, very popular, and it's very, very relevant for this issue. Okay.
Okay, let's have a look.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Yeah.
There's one here saying, I work in FE. Have you tried these techniques with 16 to 19-year-olds?
That's a very good question. We've actually used thinking reading with adults as well. So certainly thinking reading is suitable for across the age range.
Yeah, so thinking reading works. It has been used successfully with adults. And we hear some, a few, and we hear some really great stories about that. So it's entirely suitable. And in fact, we're looking at adding more materials to it at a higher level so that students who are further up the education system can continue to be stretched. I think I've answered the paired small group ones.
Yeah.
So there's a question from Sam. In the studies you showed, there seemed to be a slow start before a huge increase in pace. The slow start seemed to be about 2 months. Is this normal or extreme? It's quite normal. Engelmann talks about this as well, that when you first start out providing this kind of systematic instruction, what you're doing is focusing on closing gaps in the foundations. And so nothing much appears to be changing very much, but what you're actually doing is plugging gaps in their knowledge, and you're also changing reading behaviors and reading strategies that haven't been helpful to them before. And so then once those foundations are embedded, they can take off. I should also add that because of the reading levels expand as students go up through the levels, it artificially stretches that that graph slightly as you go up as well. So it's the reading levels are closer together lower down, but students do accelerate after the first few levels.
Okay, a question here. How would you deal with parents who are not supportive of reading intervention, perhaps due to their own literacy issues? And certainly the last school where I was working, SLT of the view, it was just part of English. It wasn't an add-on. This was extra English, and parents had no choice.
Yeah, the simplest thing to do is to say the school's in charge of curriculum. We'll decide what subject that the student does, or how they will learn English effectively. This is part of their English curriculum, and we're putting them into a special class so that they will make really great progress.
James and Diane, I think we're out of time, unfortunately.
Oh, yes, we are. Sorry.
It's gone really, really fast. It was really, really interesting. I'm going to save the questions for you in case you want to answer some more online.
Great.
If that's okay.
Thank you.
No, thank you very, very much. I'm sure people still have lots and lots to ask. Have a lovely day. Everyone, thank you very much. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.